McCartney has been a part of pop culture for a mind-bending 6 decades, having celebrated his 80th birthday in 2022. So, what better time to take a look back at the iconic Beatles member's remarkable life? Here are 30 photos that prove his journey from the backstreet clubs of Liverpool to the world stage has been, for the most part, truly fab. Cheeky grin. McCartney may only be 6 years old in this family snap taken way back in 1948, but there's still a glimpse of that cheeky grin that he'd show off throughout the Beatles' early career. The boy behind him is older brother Mike, who'd also carve out a showbiz career as a member of musical comedy trio The Scaffold. All smiles. Who could possibly have known at the time that these fresh-faced musicians would go on to help shape the course of popular music for the next half-century? Here, a young McCartney is pictured alongside the rest of his Beatles bandmates. From left to right they are guitarists George Harrison and John Lennon and drummer Ringo Starr. Press interviews. Within a few years of starting out, the Beatles had become the toast of the music world, and every man and his dog wanted a word with the various members. Here, a slightly startled McCartney is being interviewed by the Daily Mirror newspaper at his Maitland Court home in London, jumping for joy. It seems fair to say that the Beatles were pretty excited about performing in front of a royal family member for the first time. No doubt the Royal Command performance in 1963 was one of the most memorable nights for the Fab Four during their early days. Here, McCartney and co. can be seen jumping for joy as they rehearse for the big occasion, royal gathering. Sadly, we were denied a recreation of the Beatles' 1963 royal gathering in Netflix hit The Crown. Here, they're pictured shaking hands with arguably the most rock and roll member of Britain's most famous family, Princess Margaret. And she looks just as delighted to be in their company as they are in hers. Madame Tussauds. You know you've made it when you get your own carbon copy. Here, McCartney takes some time out from shooting the Beatles movie, A Hard Day's Night, to pose for the most famous waxworks museum in the world, Madame Tussauds. Yeah, that might explain why he's holding a pair of plastic eyes. Monkeying around. We thought the Monkees were the 1960s beat combo that liked monkeying around. The Beatles sure appear to be making the most of some downtime in this photo taken during their North American tour of 1964. Sadly, there isn't a follow-up snap that shows whether McCartney managed to stay on the diving board. Seeing double. So it looks as though all that posing in a fixed position for hours on end was worth it. Here, McCartney stands behind his sharp-suited waxwork look-alike at the Madame Tussauds Museum, and the star's facial expression suggests he's a little worried some people won't be able to tell the difference. Meta magazine. This is, no doubt, one of the most meta photos from the Beatles' early days. Here, a young McCartney looks slightly perturbed to be reading a magazine bearing his face. In fact, the entire 1964 publication is dedicated to the Fab Four. As you can tell from the image of the screaming girls on its back cover, Beatlemania has, by this point, well and truly begun. Ooh la la. The Beatles obviously appeared to enjoy soaking in a bit of the local culture whenever they hit a new town overseas. Here, the Fab Four try on some Gallic hats for size, while in Paris alongside a presumably French model. While McCartney's beret is on point, we can't help but admire Starr, truly committing to the theme with his Napoleon-esque headwear. Paris to London. No doubt that McCartney eventually got sick of having to travel across the world, even if it was always in the height of first-class luxury. But back in 1964, the novelty of going abroad was probably a little more appealing. He certainly seems happy enough here in the cockpit, as the Beatles head back to their Liverpool hometown. Harold Wilson. As well as mixing in royal circles, the Beatles also rubbed shoulders with members of the political elite during their rapid rise to fame. Here, McCartney is making sure his suit and tie looks as dapper as possible while getting ready for a meeting with the then Prime Minister. The musician and his bandmates enjoyed a variety club luncheon with Harold Wilson. Photo shoot. All 4 members of the Beatles look as though they have been styled by completely different people here. McCartney is rocking the dungarees and beret look, for sure. But we don't know how that fits in with Harrison's polka-dotted headwear or Lennon's leather gloves. And Starr's outfit completely fades into the black background. Ski slopes. The Beatles didn't waste much time gravitating toward the big screen. In 1964, they released Help, a madcap caper helmed by Richard Lester. And as this snow-capped photo suggests, the Fab Four were able to travel the world while shooting the flick, too. We're not quite sure how handy that broom would have come in on the ski slopes, though. Mary Hopkin, Harrison, Starr, and Lennon weren't the only musicians that McCartney collaborated with during his time in the Fab Four. The Liverpudlian also worked with several other pop stars in the swinging 60s. Here, he can be seen tinkling the ivories alongside Mary Hopkin, the Irish singer who was signed to Apple Records. Jane Asher. You might not know that before the true love of his life, Linda, came along, McCartney was in a relationship with actress Jane Asher. Here, the happy couple can be seen posing for a photo outside Glasgow's Golden Gates Hotel. And if you're wondering what their adorable sheepdog's name is, it's Martha. Taking a nap. McCartney no doubt needed some shut-eye, having just dropped one of pop music's seminal albums. Yes, this photo was taken in the summer of 1967, shortly after the Beatles released what many consider to be their piece de resistance, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Or perhaps he's just indulging in a spot of meditation. Brother's wedding. Unlike many of his Beatles bandmates, McCartney hadn't yet walked down the aisle when this photo was taken in 1968. The wedding he's attending alongside then-girlfriend Jane Asher is actually his brother Mike's. And the whole ceremony was staged at their father's house, too. Of course, the musician would soon get his turn. Linda McCartney. McCartney would famously walk down the aisle on 3 occasions. The star's first marriage to Linda McCartney is still probably the most famous, though. Here, the happy couple are snapped mid-kiss, having just emerged from a registry office. And the little girl in front of them is Linda's daughter from a previous relationship, Heather. Business and pleasure. Paul and Linda McCartney proved that it's possible to mix business with pleasure. The pair remained happily married until the latter's untimely death in 1998. And they also enjoyed a fruitful working relationship as members of 70s rock outfit Wings. Here they can be seen heading to the famous Abbey Road studios to lay down some tracks. Live and Let Die. McCartney soon proved that he could cut it without the rest of the Beatles. In the early 1970s, he was given his own ABC TV special, where he performed both his own material and various Fab Four hits. For many, the highlight was his rendition of James Bond theme Live and Let Die, Crime Against Fashion. Paul and Linda McCartney may have raised one of the world's most celebrated designers, but it doesn't appear as though Stella inherited her sense of style from her famous parents. This 1973 pic proves that the happily married couple were no stranger to crimes against fashion, not to mention crimes against hair. Rod Stewart. McCartney and wife Linda made countless famous friends during their time in the spotlight, and judging by this photo, they were particularly close to rocker Rod Stewart. The I Don't Want to Talk About It singer is certainly making at least one half of the pair laugh with his antics. Telegato Award. Grammys, Brits, American Music Awards, you name it, and Paul McCartney is likely to have won it. In 1986, he added to his trophy collection with a gong at the Telegato Awards. And despite the countless accolades he'd picked up before, the Liverpudlian still looks pretty shocked to have received it. Michael Jackson. Paul McCartney would work with Michael Jackson on 2 occasions during the 1980s. The 2 superstars first collaborated on the thriller Cut the Girl Is Mine. And they enjoyed the experience so much they duetted twice on McCartney's 4th solo LP, Pipes of Peace, including chart hit Say 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 Say. Their relationship would sour, though, when much to the Liverpudlians' dismay, Jackson bought the Beatles' back catalogue publishing rights. Man of many talents. McCartney proved once again in 1984 that he is a man of many talents. The Liverpudlian not only provided the music for feature film Give My Regards to Broad Street, but he also penned its script. Here, the star poses alongside a chorus line and wife Linda for an eye-catching press shot. David Bowie. Here we find one of the most influential musicians of the 1960s sitting alongside one of the most influential musicians of the 1970s. McCartney and David Bowie were snapped backstage at an event in the 1980s, the monumental concert known as Live Aid. And the former brought the house down with an emotive rendition of the Beatles' classic Let It Be, Peace Sign. You also know you have made it when you have your own signature pose. In fact, McCartney had two. He became renowned for holding his thumbs aloft whenever he wanted to express his approval. But the Liverpudlian was also famed for giving the peace sign whenever he was in a good mood. The Mills. It definitely wasn't second time lucky for McCartney when it came to getting hitched. Just 6 years after this picture was taken at a meeting with the Queen Mother at the Walker Art Gallery, the Beatle and wife Heather Mills went their separate ways. And to say that their split was acrimonious would be something of an understatement. Apple core. How do you like them apples? Here, McCartney joins bandmate Lennon and the Imagine singer's then-girlfriend Yoko Ono at an exclusive screening of the Beatles' 1968 animated movie Yellow Submarine at Piccadilly Circus. The fruit they're holding up signifies the company, Apple Corps, they'd formed earlier that same year. It's another snap which proves the songwriting pair were often as thick as thieves. A spectacular partnership. Of course, McCartney's friendship with Lennon was arguably the most important relationship of his life. And by common consent, the pair are considered to be among the greatest songwriters in history. They had a complex relationship, though, and there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than many knew at the time. Indeed, amidst the swinging 60s and the chaos of Beatlemania, there was love, respect, creative tension, and occasional ire between two of rock's greatest icons. Curious about the Quarrymen. The tale of Lennon and McCartney's storied friendship began on July 6, 1957, when a 15-year-old McCartney overheard his future songwriting partner playing with his skiffle band The Quarrymen at a church in Liverpool, England. McCartney stopped by to watch and was mesmerized by Lennon's stage presence and ability to work the crowd, if not his limited guitar-playing skills. First meeting. Lennon met McCartney after the show. The pair were introduced by the latter's friend Ivan Vorkin. This first moment was, of course, a hugely significant moment in music history, but obviously it didn't seem like it at the time. No, in that moment, it was just two music-obsessed teenagers from different sides of Liverpool sitting on folded chairs and talking. Not that Lennon showed much interest in his future songwriting partner McCartney in the very first instance. McCartney makes his mark. It took the then 15-year-old McCartney to take the guitar he was carrying off his back and start playing Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and Gene Vincent's Bebop a Lula for Lennon to take notice. He was suddenly transfixed by McCartney's musicianship, and in an interview a few years later conceded, "I dug him." An undeniable chemistry. The chemistry between the pair soon became apparent once McCartney had shown his talent. One of the Quarrymen would later claim that on the day they met, Lennon and McCartney had circled each other like cats. Maybe, like their feline counterparts, they were trying to figure each out at this early stage. McCartney joins the band. Of course, Lennon would go on to invite McCartney to join his band shortly after. But although he was impressed by the talented teenager 2 years his junior, Lennon would reveal some fascinating insights into his thought process on that day 10 years later, details that shine a light on the dynamics of their relationship. Kingpin. A decade on from that 1957 meeting, when McCartney had played those songs so brilliantly to him, Lennon spoke to journalist Hunter Davies and revealed his initial concerns about his future bandmate. He said, "I half thought to myself, he's as good as me. I'd been Kingpin up to then. Now, I thought, if I take him on, what will happen?" Lennon's decision. Lennon, then, was clearly both awed and intimidated by this musical prodigy. He told Rolling Stone in 1970, "I had a group. I was the singer and the leader. Then I met Paul, and I had to make a decision. Was it better to have a guy who was better than the guy I had in? To make the group stronger, or to let me be stronger? Bond over rock and roll." Thankfully for all music lovers, Lennon took the option of making his group stronger, and the pair did bond personally, particularly over their shared love of rock and roll. In a 2016 interview with Rolling Stone, McCartney said, "John and me, we were kids growing up together, in the same environment with the same influences. Shared loss." Lennon and McCartney's kinship was also deepened by the personal heartbreak of them both losing their mums when they were young. McCartney was only 14 when his mother, Mary, died from cancer. Lennon, meanwhile, was 17 when his mum, Julia, was hit by a speeding car in July 1958, but it seems the pair often hid their inner pain. Heartbreaking feeling. The hurt was real, though. We had a kind of bond that we both knew about that we knew that feeling, McCartney said on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert in 2019. "I never thought that it affected my music until years later. I certainly didn't mean it to be. But it could be, you know, those things can happen." This was a different era. Men were expected to man up, and Lennon and McCartney largely conformed to this orthodoxy. Happy times in Hamburg. That's not to say that there weren't a lot of happy times for Lennon and McCartney in the early days of the Beatles, or that they were always faking their smiles. Far from it. The band and their chief creative forces had some wild times in their formative years, in their hometown of Liverpool, and in particular in Hamburg, Germany. Things started to get rock and roll. Indeed, in Hamburg the Beatles really came of age, not just in the sense of growing musically into a formidable live act, but also in effectively becoming adults and bonding together tightly as a unit. And yes, Lennon and McCartney, like their fellow bandmates, fully indulged themselves in the rock and roll lifestyle, fun and frolics. McCartney would later recall the decadent early years spent in shared hotels in Hamburg. Let's just say they were eventful times for the four high-spirited young men. McCartney told GQ in 2018 there were sexual encounters of the celestial kind, and there were groupies. And legend has it George Harrison, losing his virginity in the same room, brought applause from the other three army buddies. But the whole experience out there in Germany would really bring them together. I mean, I think in the end this was one of the strengths of the Beatles, this enforced closeness which I always likened to army buddies, McCartney recalled. Because you're all in the same barracks. We were always very close and on top of each other, which meant you could totally read each other, eyeball to eyeball. This, of course, included John and Paul, who were near inseparable at that time. Lennon remarked to Playboy magazine in 1980 that the pair wrote music eyeball to eyeball in the early times. The beginning of their songwriting partnership would also result in a famous teenage pact between the pair. Teenage pact. That pact was the agreement that any song penned by John or Paul, even if it was individually constructed, would be credited as a Lennon-McCartney work. Lennon revealed the deal with the co-credit in one of the last interviews he ever gave. He said, "We always had that thing that our names would go on songs even if we didn't write them. It was never a legal deal between Paul and me, just an agreement to put both our names on our songs." Lennon steps in. But according to McCartney's autobiography, many years from now, he initially wished for those names to be listed the other way round. And they almost were. On the very first copies of the Beatles' 1963 debut Please Please Me, the duo's original songs were marked McCartney-Lennon, but someone stepped in to change that. Lennon-McCartney, not McCartney-Lennon. Indeed, McCartney wrote in Many Years From Now, "I wanted it to be McCartney-Lennon, but John had the stronger personality and I think he fixed things." He added, "I remember going to a meeting and being told, 'We think you should credit the songs to Lennon-McCartney. Lennon-McCartney sounds better. It has a better ring,' I had to say. All right. Fundamentally different." McCartney appears to touch on an important point here in his relationship with Lennon. John was not only his senior by some 20 months, but more often than not, he also had the more forceful personality. They were fundamentally different characters, but that's arguably what made them work so well together. Songwriting secrets. And they certainly did that, propelled by a rivalry that was initially friendly but grew increasingly fraught further down the line. While the pair would often write lyrics and music together in the early days, they would just as often compose most of a song themselves before bringing it to the other for suggestions, criticism and embellishments. This process resulted in some of the best-known and most loved songs in popular music history. Tug of War. George Martin, the famed producer who helmed the majority of the Beatles albums, once defined Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership and personal relationship as being like two people pulling on a rope, smiling at each other and pulling all the time with all their might. The tension between the two of them made for the bond. Stark differences. Down the years, other people in the know have drawn attention to the stark differences between Lennon and McCartney, both in terms of their personalities and their outlook on life. But they noted how this worked in both their and the band's favor. For instance, Lennon's first wife Cynthia once said, John needed Paul's attention to detail and persistence. Paul needed John's anarchic, lateral thinking. Single creative being. Geoff Emerick, an EMI engineer who worked on several Beatles albums, wrote in his memoir that he thought Lennon and McCartney effectively formed a single creative being. In his view, the Beatles was Lennon-Paul-McCartney, which seems a bit dismissive of Harrison and Ringo Starr. Chalk and cheese. Still, Emerick also wrote in here, there and everywhere about the clear differences between the pair that he observed when he worked in the studio with them. He wrote, Paul was meticulous and organized. He always carried a notebook around with him, in which he methodically wrote down lyrics and chord changes in his neat handwriting. In contrast, John seemed to live in chaos. He was constantly searching for scraps of paper that he'd hurriedly scribbled ideas on. Odd couple. Emerick seemed to think that Lennon and McCartney were an odd couple, and was perhaps surprised that their friendship worked at all. He wrote, Paul was a natural communicator. John couldn't articulate his ideas well. Paul was the diplomat. John was the agitator. Paul was soft-spoken and almost unfailingly polite. John could be a right loudmouth and quite rude. Paul was willing to put in long hours to get a part right. John was impatient, always ready to move on to the next thing. Beatlemania. Anyway, unless you've been living under a rock for 60 years, you'll know that the Beatles and their chief songwriters conquered the UK, then America and the world. Yes, from 1963 and the release of their debut studio record Please Please Me, the band enjoyed a meteoric rise to stardom, both enjoying and enduring massive fame and screaming fans everywhere in a period now widely labeled Beatlemania. Record-breaking partnership. For 7 remarkable years from the release of their debut LP, Lennon and McCartney lived with increasingly intense levels of fame and adulation. Their songwriting partnership was quickly shaping up to be among the most remarkable in rock history. For instance, by 1966 they had penned 88 original songs that had sold somewhere around 200 million records, holding each other in check. But how did Lennon and McCartney's songwriting work, given their differences? Their mutual friend from Liverpool, Pete Shotton, arguably summarized it best. He told website Slate, Paul's presence did serve to keep John from drifting too far into obscurity and self-indulgence, just as John's influence held in check the more facile and sentimental aspects of Paul's songwriting. Grit vs. melody. Shotton's comments tend to ring true. McCartney was seemingly always the sentimental and dreamy one of the pair, whilst Lennon tended to bring grit and the blues. The former cared more for melody, the latter favoured soul-bearing rock and roll. In short, they not only complemented one another, they completed each other. Until, that is, things started to get a bit more complicated and, dare we say, messy, different directions. By 1967, tensions in the relationship between Lennon and McCartney had begun to become more prominent. The pair, who had always had some conflicting interests and differing ideas on how to do things, began to clash over the direction of the band. McCartney had become more prominent as a leader in the band, whilst Lennon became depressed over his failed first marriage and the psychedelics GT. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band concept was largely of the younger man's making. Power struggle. Many factors have been cited as helping bring about the eventual breakup of the Beatles. They include their weariness of fame and Beatlemania, manager Brian Epstein's death, Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono and Harrison's wish to record more songs. But at the center of it all was the power struggle between the old pals Lennon and McCartney. White Album woes. That struggle intensified by the time the band were recording what would become the Beatles, the expansive double record more commonly called the White Album. Some argue that LP is the band's best, and it certainly contains some of Lennon and McCartney's and Harrison's best songs. But by then, the eyeball-to-eyeball way of working the two friends had once favored was well and truly gone. Their relationship had changed for good. Ono's presence caused conflict, and McCartney and Lennon began voicing disapproval of each other's songs. John mocked Paul's whimsical tracks like Martha, My Dear, and he in return despaired at avant-garde collages like Revolution 9. McCartney later admitted there was a lot of friction during that album, while Lennon quipped that you could hear the breakup of the Beatles on it. The end is nigh. The rising tension between McCartney, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr meant the Beatles really came to an end in 1969, although the news was announced by McCartney in April 1970. This led many to believe that McCartney had been to blame for the demise of the world's most popular band. This theory was widely regarded as gospel for many years, and Lennon seemed to do little to disprove it. Warring friends. Much has been written about the end of the Beatles and the supposed hostility between Lennon and McCartney in the decade after, before Lennon's murder in December 1980. Of course, there were pointed songs like McCartney's Too Many People and Lennon's How Do You Sleep. Plus, the former's lawsuit added fuel to that fire too. Yet in recent years, McCartney has looked to set the record straight on it all. McCartney speaks out.